this to the street. Didn't give you much of a notice, did I? Who can see the camera? Am I on the camera? Hello, welcome.
It's a little bit of an echo.
Yes, but can you see if I'm on the screen?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Well, welcome to our front porch. This is the second of our series, and it's a beautiful night. I hope maybe you're sitting out on your front porch and joining us for this conversation. This has been a great idea that Larry came up with, and I'm really grateful for your help, Larry. He has gathered up a bunch of knowledgeable professors from the history department and the political science department, and tonight our guest is Ute Chamberlin. So just want to say thank you to our members and the people here in the audience, as well as the Illinois Humanities Council for their COVID relief grant to help us put on these sort of newfangled programs. So on our front porch, what we do is we try to exchange ideas and learn from each other, like any good space and company, right? So please introduce yourself in the comment section, say hello. We also ask that people are respectful, just like you would be in someone's home, and ask good questions. That's what this is all about. How's this going to work? So Larry, you did such a great job last time. We're going to keep you as being in charge. You're the facilitator today. And Ute's going to share her knowledge about the Hitler and the German history. So we will alternate questions between online and in person. We have a handful of people here. You can use the comment section below, and I'll be monitoring those and passing them to our guests on the porch here. So please give us some feedback and ask some questions. And I think that's about all we got, right?
That's it.
I think I'll see if I can get rid of that sound back there for you.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, hold on.
Let me know.
All right, go ahead and get started and I'll.
Good evening. Welcome back. You may remember me from last time, or this may be your first time with us. I'm Larry Balsamo, retired chair of history here at Western Illinois University. I'm sort of a facilitator tonight. I want to introduce my friend and my colleague, Dr. Ute Chamberlin, who is our specialist in German history, modern European history, European women's history, and is a published author in the field, widely respected, just back fresh from a sabbatical where she researched. Our topic tonight is Ein Reich, Ein Volk, Ein Führer, getting to come to grips with Nazi Germany and what life was like from the viewpoint of the people who lived through it and those who were affected by it. So we're going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to pause periodically for questions that will drive the conversation. And so welcome Ute, you're on.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I'd also like to say thank you to both Sue and Larry for putting this event together. We are living in difficult times. It's not always easy to come together and to have an interesting conversation. And so I think this is just a wonderful forum to do that. And we're also living in pretty unsettled times politically and socially. And so we are right in the middle of history, right? And so I sometimes find it very reassuring when things are seemingly chaotic around us because we don't have the big perspective yet. I find it reassuring to go back to more distant history because there we can reflect more carefully about what has happened in the past. And so history can be a very nice escape from current turmoil. That's how I see it right now. And so I should also say that Larry has his office across from mine. We talk a lot. We have good conversations, right?
We exchange books. I borrow books from you.
That's right. And so it's always very pleasant to talk with Larry, and I'm glad that we can extend this into this environment here as well. And so the topic that I picked for today is the Nazi period, but from the perspective of ordinary people. There is, and of course, if you have other questions, of course, we can discuss them as well. But there's a term for this in historiography. It's called Alltagsgeschichte. I'll bombard you with a couple of tricky words here every now and then. But Alltagsgeschichte can be translated as the history of everyday life. It's been around for quite a while, but it's this focus on looking at the lives of ordinary people and to see how they lived through, decisive periods in history, and also to recognize that they had agency and ability to influence things. And I think that's particularly important when we come to the Nazi period, because the history writing about the Nazis right after 45 was often focused on Hitler as the evil mastermind who pushed Germany into the abyss, and Germans also like to see themselves as hapless victims in this process. And so when we look at Alltagsgeschichte, we can look a little bit more critically at how ordinary people lived, what positions they assumed, and whether they wanted to conform or to resist. And I think another attraction of Alltagsgeschichte is that it's a way for us to place us back into history. I think especially when it comes to Nazi history, I'm sure that if you think about the Nazi period, that all of you, maybe not all, I don't know all of you, but at least for me, it's sort of a recurring question. I ask myself, what would I have done in a situation like that when you see a republic destroyed and a dictator comes into power with very distinct racial prejudice and a pretty scary approach to putting his racial ideas into practice. And so I think that's a way to connect with history, to put yourself into the place of the ordinary people that lived through this time period. And so that's sort of my big idea here that guides me in my view of the Nazi period. Larry said a couple of other interesting things last time about how he looks at history. History is interpretation, right? New books about the Nazis and about Hitler are written all the time, so the focus changes. There are still new documents that come to the fore every once in a while, and so it's an ever-evolving field of history. And history is complex. There are no simple explanation for any kind of development. If you ask me why did Hitler come to power, you'll get a long response. There's no monocausal explanation for that at all. I use a textbook when I teach an introductory methods course that sketches out the evolution of the student in the way he or she thinks about history. And it starts with thinking about history as just boring facts, random facts. Then the next stage is that you're able to put them into chronology, and then you realize complexity. And first you are confused and frightened by complexity because it's complicated. And sort of the final level of, historical awareness is when you embrace complexity and you realize that's really the fun part about history. History is complicated, and that's the best thing about it. So that's a little bit of my philosophy here as well. Maybe one last thing, sort of in a general approach to the history of the Nazis. We know how the story ends, right? We know that the Nazis were defeated, Hitler committed suicide, we know the escalation towards the Holocaust. And so we tend sometimes too much to look at history with hindsight because we know the end results, and we might think that we can see straight lines of development because they become obvious with hindsight, but they were often not readily visible for the people who lived through that time period. One of the books that I have on the suggested readings list that you have either as a handout or electronically on your screen right now is a book by Peter Gay. It's called My German Question. Peter Gay grew up as Peter Fröhlich in Berlin, became a famous historian here after his family escaped from Nazi Germany just in time. So they literally, that's a digression, but it's interesting too. So their name was Fröhlich in Germany. Fröhlich means cheerful or gay. And so that's how they translated their last name to sort of signify that they were taking a fresh start in the United States. But my point here is that he has a chapter in his book about his childhood in Berlin, and it's called Mixed Signals. And so to me, that is very telling. As for a young Jewish boy to live during this time period, it was difficult for him to decipher what was going on. And I think that was the case for adults as well. Very briefly, I'd like to say, and then we can start with questions, I'd like to talk about this image that I have, that I gave Sue. It is this postcard that has the slogan on it, Ein Reich, Ein Volk, ein Führer. And it's a much used slogan by the Nazis that says a lot about the Nazi period and also about how ordinary people were supposed to think about it. And so Ein Reich, so Reich is the German word for empire. The Nazis wanted to establish the 1,000-year Reich, the Third Reich, and so the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. The second one was the German Empire that was established in 1871 and lasted until the end of World War I. And so Hitler always wanted to show himself sort of as a successor, right, of older traditions. He didn't want to be seen as somebody who came in and destroyed everything. He saw himself as recreating something rather than creating a new horrible regime. Ein Reich also can be seen from a territorial perspective. One of the key things that the Nazis wanted for their Reich was living space or Lebensraum. So you can also think of that in geographic terms. And you see that particularly in this postcard, because this is a postcard that already has Austria included as territory. Austria was the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria came in March of 1938. And so this postcard shows the Reich in its gradual expansion, right? It's Austria, next would be Czechoslovakia, Poland, and then the Soviet Union. So it's this encroaching on Eastern Europe that is already indicated here that the Reich is going to expand, it's going to expand east. The second term, Ein Volk, can be innocently translated as a people. But when the Nazis used the term, they imbued it with their kind of meaning, and it meant a racially defined people, right? And so you could only be part of the German folk if you were racially an Aryan, which was very ambiguously defined, but you were only that way you could be part of this folk. And so this is the racial element of the central racial element of how the Nazis and Hitler imagined Germany to be. And then finally, of course, Ein Führer. So at the very top is Hitler, who guides everybody through this. Everybody looks up to him. He cannot be criticized. He is above all kinds of squabble, and he is the person who is going to lead Germans to this goal. Maybe one more point about this sort of big picture that sits over everything. And I'm taking this from another historian named Peter Fritsche. And he has explained in his work quite nicely how this slogan, for instance, indicates this great unity, right? Everybody is in it together. But it also means that people are outside of it. There are people who don't belong. So it's this stark contrast between insider and outsider. You're either part of this fantastic thing, according to the Nazis, or you're cast out, and that's a horrible place to be. And so the Nazis always thought in black and white. You're either part of us, or you are outside, and you have to, or you do belong, and then you have to be expelled. And so this either or, in or out, you're either one of us or we reject you completely. That's also an integral element of the of German society under the Nazis. And so that just as a way of introduction. And so, Sue, I don't know whether you have some questions lined up already that we can get started with?
I am not finding any questions.
Okay, let me ask.
Okay, there you go.
I'll help out here.
Okay, I'll try to be ready.
From your perspective,
Question.
is there a particular sections of Germany geographically which are more receptive or supportive of Nazi National Socialism from the beginnings, the party, let's say until the beginning of World War II?
Okay, geographically, I would say you have to combine geography with occupation, place in society. And so first of all, the Nazis wanted to be a Volkspartei, a people's party. They wanted to be populist. They claimed that they had something to offer for everybody. And in that respect, they were different from the other major parties in Germany who had their very well-defined constituencies, right? The Center Party had the Catholic vote. The SPD, the Social Democrats, they had the workers' vote. The communists, those were the radical, often unskilled workers. And they are the nationalists who go to the NVP. And so the Nazis wanted to overcome these kind of divisions and appeal to everybody. They were unevenly successful because the hold on these other groups, the other groups had strong ties to their traditional parties. And so when we go to the German southwest, southeast, Bavaria, where the Nazi movement began, there Hitler, of course, he finds supporters, but he also has to compete with the strong vote of the Center Party there. In general, he is very successful, much more successful with Protestant voters, rural voters, farmers, and small town people. I know we've talked before about William Sheridan Allen's book about a small town in Germany, which is, the real name of the town is Nordheim, it's near Hanover, and so it's a small town that overwhelmingly went over to the Nazis. So this Protestant small town environment, that's where the Nazis thrived. Lower middle class was also attracted by the Nazis. So let's say small shop owners who felt squeezed out by big business. That's another subgroup. The Nazis had a much tougher time winning workers over. So that means in large urban areas, they had a harder time finding voters, finding supporters. But then there are also maybe some surprising pockets of support. For instance, among young, on average, Nazi voters were young, quite young, and also the elderly, retired people. So there's an interesting sort of breakdown in that respect. But for instance, young university students supported Hitler often because they had real anxieties about finding a job after they got their education, and they liked the fact that Hitler was going to discriminate against Jewish people who were overrepresented in academia. So so you get this really interesting patchwork that comes from every corner of German society, but in uneven measures, I would say.
Did this alter over time, or does it remain pretty fixed all the way through?
Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because we have one more election after January of 1933, and then there are no choices anymore, right? And so it's I don't know whether there are data that you could look at to see changing alliances.
Did the quality of life for people in Nazi Germany change dramatically right from the beginning when Hitler was in power, or did it change over time? I mean, things like income, freedom of travel, freedom of association.
Well, it depends on, you mean, is it quality of life? Well, it depends on who you were. I think if you were a Nazi supporter, you must have been elated, right? Because your guy was finally in power. If you were somebody who believed in the values of living in a republic and a participatory democracy, it must have been shattering, right? If you were Jewish, things got worse. It was gradual, but it also began right away. Things got more restrictive for women. They were pushed out of good-paying jobs, were pressured to marry and have children, leave the workplace. So it really depends on who you look at. Economically, the economy recovered. Hitler claimed that it was all his doing, but it was actually part of a general recovery after the Great Depression. So they sort of rode that wave to a certain extent too, and sort of a certain measure of prosperity returned. But wages stayed behind, for instance, so people did not earn as much as they had before. I'm thinking of well-known propaganda films like Triumph of the Will, where Hitler arrives in Nuremberg and everything is neat and clean and the people are well dressed, they look happy and healthy. Of course, that's what he wanted to convey, right? But it really it really depends on what are the things that make your life better or worse. If you don't care about the political system, if you're anti-Semitic anyways, then yeah, probably was better. But if you had if you believed in democracy and tolerance and equal rights for everybody, not so much.
Interesting, you mentioned Triumph of the Will, Lady Riefenstahl, the director. Would you say she was probably the most famous woman of the Nazi period, or the best known nationally, maybe the most talented? How would you describe her?
She was talented. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, I would say that she was probably the most successful woman under the Nazis, because there was a women's organization. Gertrud Scholz-Klink was the woman who ran that, and she had sort of her little empire of women that she could rule over, if we want to talk about it casually like that, but it was also very well confined. Beyond that, she really didn't have all that much to say. Leni Riefenstahl had a much bigger impact because she produced some of the most successful propaganda films of the Nazis, hobnobbed with Hitler and Goebbels, and had enormous success. And so Triumph of the Will is probably the best known film, and Olympia, the movie that she made, or the documentary that she made about the 1936 Olympics as well. And she's a very complicated case, because she did win prizes for her work outside of Germany, in France and in Italy, when her films were shown. So it's this very difficult contradiction between her artistry and skill as a film director and the subjects that she chose or was willing to focus on in her work, right? And so, of course, she said that she was just a director, that she was unpolitical, but that's sort of ludicrous. That just doesn't bear out. Do you have a question, Sue?
We've got some questions coming in. So let me take this off. So Aaron is asking, what was the Night of the Long Knives?
Okay, so the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. Do you remember the exact date? I think you're much better.
June, wasn't it? June
It was
34?
June, yeah, something like that. So June 1934. So the Night of the Long Knives was primarily an attack on the leaders of the Sturmabteilung, the SA. And so a little bit of a backstory here. So the SA was the paramilitary organization that the Nazis had built up over quite a while. And by the time that Hitler came into power, they were maybe 400, 500,000 men strong. And the person who was running the SA was a man named Ernst Röhm. And Röhm belonged to something that is sometimes called the left wing of the Nazi party. And so he belonged to those Nazi leaders who believe that there should be a real revolution, sort of a real revolutionary overhaul where German society as it existed would be transformed. And he also had at least sort of this vision, not a concrete plan, that maybe the SA could replace the regular army. And this, so for Hitler and Goebbels, this became a sort of was an internal threat to his leadership. And so during the Night of the Long Knives, Röhm is arrested. He's later executed, and a whole bunch of other people are arrested at the same time. People who Hitler wanted to settle scores with, and maybe 200 or so people were executed. But the main purpose was to cut the SA down to size and to disabuse them of any notion that they could possibly become the next German army. Hitler, with his war plans that he always thought about, knew that he could only accomplish his goals with the German army, the regular army, the well-trained army, and not with these sort of paramilitary thugs. And so Röhm was basically the last opposition that Hitler eliminated. And so after the Night of the Long Knives, which is presented to the German public as this valiant and successful effort to sort of avoid a coup, basically, against Hitler's leadership. After that, Hitler is really without any kind of internal opposition. Hindenburg, the president, dies shortly thereafter, and that then leaves Hitler alone in control. And so the significance of the Night of the Long Knives is that it is the moment where Hitler's power is sort of complete.
Can I add something? Part of the SA was an organization called the SS, which are protective squads, I guess.
Well, they're separate. I mean, they're not part.
But they had been part of the SI originally, and they're the ones in the black uniforms with the silver collar emblems. They get weapons from the army to help kill off the leadership of the SA. And when Hindenburg dies a little bit later, the armed forces, every soldier, every airman, every sailor swears an oath of personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler by name. And that's sort of the payback, it seems to me, of Hitler consolidating power and also breaking the SA down to a smaller size, so it wasn't a threat to the army.
Yeah, the army was happy with this. This eliminated a group that they perceived as unwelcome rivals. I mean, this personal oath, it starts with the army, but it's later extended to all civil servants, and so it becomes sort of it permeates everything. It starts with the army, but it becomes a common thing everywhere.
Great. Does anybody here? Oh, go ahead, Gary.
Go ahead, Mac.
My name is Gary.
Hi, Gary.
How you doing? Thank you very much. My mother-in-law moved in with us. She lived in Munich from, I think, 43 on for a while.
Oh my goodness, okay. Yeah.
Her husband had a lumberyard in Munich. When I went to, and she moved in with us after she came over the country here. When I come home every once in a while, I'd see her watching on the War Channel, World War II and the Nazism. And I finally got her to talk to me a little bit about it.
Yeah.
And she said, I never knew any of this happened. Now, she had immigrated from Lithuania with her husband down to Munich. Could you expound on what the Nazi Party told the civilian,
So
please?
you mean, what happened to you mean the Holocaust, right? The persecution of Jews or,
Just the average German
yeah, what they,
housewife.
yeah. So, so officially, of course, the Nazis did not broadcast what they were doing in the East, right? And so there was no official acknowledgement that there were extermination camps or anything like that. But so much information made it back through informal ways to Germany that I find it hard to believe that somebody would know nothing. Because, I mean, first of all, you would notice that Jewish people that used to live in your city,
They're gone.
they are no longer there. And nobody, so you hear something about labor camps somewhere far away. Well, are you going to buy that story, right? Because their property gets sold, and sometimes there are public auctions where people can buy property that was left behind by local Jews. Soldiers wrote letters back. Soldiers took photos of atrocities that made it back. Young people, young men had to do sort of a labor service before they entered the army proper, and they were often sent to Poland and beyond, where they would come very, close to atrocities. So information to claim that, so in order to understand what was going on, you had to have sort of these communications, I think, with other ordinary people, where maybe the son is at the front and the letter comes back, and people talk, right? You talk to your neighbors, you talk in your family. And so I find it, so I'm sure that people have to grapple with what is truth and what is rumor, what is exaggerated or not. But to claim that they had no clue what was happening with the civilians in the East, it's hard to believe. And I think that's where historians are going more and more, that there was actually quite a bit of information there because it traveled in all these different ways. And also think about, for instance, a place like Auschwitz, sort of central place, a huge area with local people around too, right? These were not operations that could be hidden in any effective way. And so I think, so to reiterate, there were multiple informal channels of information that did make it back to Germany. So that's sort of my understanding.
That's the way I would conclude too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Take another call from online here, and then we'll come back to the group here. So we have a question from Tim. In the Nazi Party early elections, were German-speaking people living outside of Germany eligible to vote? And if so, did they vote? Like the Turks in Germany today.
Oh, okay. All I can do here is educated guess. I don't think they did. And that's sort of a short answer. I'm not aware of any kind of remote voting. That's interesting. I haven't thought about
I
that.
don't think they could ever vote. After Hitler got into power, there was an organization of Germans living abroad.
Well, so I'm thinking the elections, I think the question was early elections.
Yeah.
I assume that's before 33.
Sure.
So was there a mail-in vote the way we have it today? I doubt it. I think you just had to go to the polls and cast your vote, and that was it. So that's, I'm not so educated guess.
Question over here?
Anybody else have a question?
Yes, go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, we all know that the armistice after World War I, it is conceded today that it was extremely harsh on Germany. And the sense of defeat and shame that followed World War I, and the unemployment that then went into the Great Depression, that it was surely as pronounced as it was in 1933 here with FDR and his approach to this massive unemployment. I'm sure this, the understanding of the fertile ground for the rise of a dictator and a flatterer and a person, a leader who is quick to create a scapegoat, that is the German Jewry, international Jewry. Would you elaborate a little bit on the pain of all of this and the disappearance of the earlier officer class and the profound connection between that and what suffered later on?
Okay, well, that's a complex question. Let me try to sort of look at that chronologically here. So first of all, so the war is over. Pretty much all Germans cannot accept the fact that Germany has been defeated because they had been led to believe the opposite. The final defeat comes somewhat unexpectedly. And so this incredible resentment against the end of the war that permeates society. So that kind of feeling was there based on sort of in a distorted understanding of what really happened, right? And so that's for sure. And people like Hitler were able to build on that resentment, right? And so many disgruntled soldiers found their way into his organization, but also other organizations. And there were right-wing groups like Hitler's Nazi Party. They were a dime a dozen right after the war, right? The Nazi Party is minuscule and regional and really doesn't rise to national prominence until 1930 in terms of voting numbers. Now, and then comes the Treaty of Versailles, which is called the Dictate, right? It's dictated to the Germans. They are claimed that they were responsible for the war, and so it's, let me put it this way, boo-hoo, it's that was the reality. I think one useful comparison is that just half a year earlier, in March of 1918, the Germans had negotiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia at the end of the war. And boy, was that a harsh treaty, taking enormous territory away from the Russians at that point. And so I think that the Germans really didn't have that much of a basis for complaint because they dished something like that out just half a year earlier to the Russians. So, just to put that into perspective. So Versailles is harsh because it has territorial losses in it and the reparations payments. I don't think they were anything that they were not inherently, they did not inherently doom the Weimar Republic. I think these things could have been overcome if not other factors had intervened. So here we are getting into this idea of complexity, right? Mm-hmm. So, and there are several attempts. The reparations payments get renegotiated at several points. So it's what is the word? It's a burden. It's a liability. That's what I was looking for. It's a liability, yes, but not something that dooms the republic. So historians increasingly move away from this idea that the Weimar Republic was doomed from the start. Mm-hmm. Other factors interact to ultimately doom it, but Germany, for instance, survives the hyperinflation and economic crisis that comes with the Ruhr occupation in 1923, and the economy recovers, so there's a period of prosperity and stability in the mid-1920s, and so that was achieved, right? And then, of course, comes the big whammy, the global depression, and that then gives the Nazis an opening to capitalize on the widespread misery at the time. But in 1923, when this first huge economic crisis hits, the Nazis do not gain traction. You know, that's when Hitler tries the beer hall putsch and ends up in prison, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
One other question that is related. After the armistice, after Versailles, I know there were rather strict controls of armaments and of guns and of officer groups to get together again to exercise their skills. But was there oversight by the victors of this?
Well, so the German army was limited to 100,000 men. That was the official number. And so there's a treaty with the Russians in 1922, sort of to reestablish contact, and then secret training is moved to Russian sites. And there was a League of Nations overseer or something. I don't know whether Larry remembers more details about that, but they were duped. They didn't really sort of understand what was secretly happening behind, the scenes in Russia. And so, in other words, the army never acknowledged that they were cut down to size. They almost immediately tried to regain strength in these secretive ways.
And the army of 100,000, these weren't 100,000 raw privates that were brought in. A lot of these guys were senior non-commissioned officers, experienced combat veterans. They were a nucleus for an army to grow bigger in time. And this is the time when the Germans are beginning to think about using tanks, and they're doing these experimental maneuvers in Russia in secret with the connivance of the communist government. So it wasn't like Germany was hapless. They did lose a lot of offensive capability, but I think the last thing the German army was thinking of in the 1920s was an offensive action against the French. They may have hated the French, but they recognized the French were a very stronger force. When we're talking about the Weimar Republic, I'm always struck by what a flowering of culture there was in the Weimar period. In music, isn't this where Bauhaus
So
architecture comes from,
interior
and
design,
art and
yes.
all kinds of stuff.
Literature, yeah.
I mean, that's, we can talk about that too, but let's maybe see whether there are other questions.
We've got some other questions.
Yeah, there's some here.
Sure, go ahead.
But how were the Nazis and Hitler able to build up their army? Did they draft men in the army, or just they have lots of
Yes,
training camps, or just?
yes.
Right, so once Hitler once Hitler admitted publicly that he was rebuilding the army, then the draft was instituted and the numbers then skyrocketed. Yeah.
That was 1935, when he officially openly admitted that Germany was rearming.
Yeah. And so then the sheer number is beefed up fairly quickly. Yeah.
We have some questions online maybe here. Let's see.
I have
So-
another question, may I?
Sure, go ahead.
We often see on TV, or I see on TV, on the history of a lot of these massive construction projects, both military and civilian, that are just outstanding, huge. They seem to be, large capital involvement. I just wondered how they finance some of these structures, both, these submarine pens and these massive bunkers, and in fact, there's even a place up in the Baltic, they had this sort of resort area, this big hotel.
Oh, you know about Pola?
Yeah, I know.
Good
Just
for
amazing,
you.
our place was still there. How do they afford all of these things? Just utterly amazing.
Okay, so Pola on the island of Rügen, this is sort of, if we ever get to travel again, I've never had a chance to see that. It's being redeveloped now as part museum, part hotel site. So it's PRORA, if you Google that. It's pretty much, it's an amazing example of, gigantism.
Oh,
that
it's
the Nazis,
huge, yeah.
it's incredible,
Quarter
and very
mile.
monotonous. And so the Nazis, they spent recklessly, and the idea was that this would be all recouped by the areas that they would conquer. So you get the oil from Romania, the Ukrainian grain basket, the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, and so it was absolutely reckless. Part of that already happened before 1939, when the Nazis spent, for instance, money on the Autobahn system. And this is all built on very irresponsible financial budget decisions. But the idea was, what does it matter? We'll conquer everything, and then the riches will pay for all. So that's sort of the short end of it. But how do you know about Pola? Did you see something on TV about that?
Yes, there was a program on TV. I don't,
Yeah.
there was a History Channel or something, but it was an amazing place. How it was still existed. It was like it's almost in perfect condition. You had good parts of it. They were still using it, and it was.
Yeah. Well, it was part of the communist East Germany after the war, and they used they used it as military barracks. So they used the facilities. It's just nice to hear, there's these typical topics that always get rehashed about the Nazis. It's nice to hear that you found, a really different and equally much more interesting element that is at the same time so typical of what the Nazis wanted to achieve. And so Pola, that was part of probably the most popular program that the Nazis ever put into action. It was the Strength Through Joy program. Strength Through Joy, Kraft durch Freude. And so that was a seemingly unpolitical program that it subsidized vacations, right? And so, for instance, cruises in the Mediterranean for ordinary people, right? So the type of luxury that an ordinary person could never afford. And Pola, the resort, was meant to be used for German workers who would then get a subsidized vacation on the Baltic Sea. But again, in this gigantic form where you would have pretty regimented vacations, right? With a little bit of Nazi indoctrination sprinkled on top of everything. But so very, very typical of what the Nazis wanted to accomplish. And so Strength Through Joy, that they did theater productions, they subsidized lectures, they did vacations, that kind of stuff. Whether you were a Nazi or not, ordinary Germans liked that program. And of course, then you get into this sort of insidious territory where you say, well, I don't really like the Nazis and their racist attitudes, but boy, that Strength Through Joy program, that is great. I get to take a subsidized vacation, right? And sometimes these seemingly unpolitical programs are much more effective than sort of this blatant in-your-face racist or anti-Semitic rhetoric, right? It's a very effective way to subvert people to sort of accept the regime.
Can you spell that again?
Remember too, that this was in part substitute for the government closing down labor unions. So you pick up free vacations, but you lose a bargaining. It's not equal, but.
No, I mean, there were labor unions. There was the free labor unions had to dissolve, and the Nazi labor union the labor front was put into place. Yeah. And so this Strength Through Joy program was meant to be a social equalizer, right? That's because now ordinary people you can do things that are associated with the sort of the better to do, right? And so every once in a while, the Nazis tried to sort of appeal to focus on their claims that they wanted to erase class divisions and class distinctions. By and large, they did not accomplish that, but the Strength Through Joy program was probably more successful than others at that.
Can you spell that again?
Strength through joy is the English term Kraft durch Freude. Kraft, K-R-A-F-T.
The one that I can look up.
Oh, Pola.
Yeah,
P-R-O-R-A.
thank you.
Okay. We've got a question kind of related to also
Yeah,
events.
I'm not,
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
I've got my hand on the
I'm sorry.
computer.
Yeah.
So Aaron is asking, why was the Reich fire such an important event?
Oh, the Reichstag fire. And so that happens in February after the Hitler has been appointed chancellor. And so why is it important? Because ultimately you get the enabling act after it. And so this act that suspends the constitution supposedly for 4 years, of course, it goes beyond that, and Hitler can make decisions without having to deal with parliament anymore. And so that's sort of the end of that story. So the Reichstag burns down, and there's some historical controversy, I would say, about how it happened. My personal understanding, the story that I like to buy into, and I want to hear what Larry thinks about that too, is that it really was a lone Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe was his name, who I think yes, so I remember the story. I think he tried to get to the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And didn't make it, turned around and decided to set the Reichstag on fire. And so probably acted on his own. And so the Nazis used that to claim that there's this vast communist conspiracy afoot, and that the communist movement in Germany has to be crushed. And so they go after the communists with a vengeance after the burning of the Reichstag, because it gives them the pretext to do so. So there are some people who think that the Nazis set the fire themselves so that they could claim this. I'm inclined not to believe it. I think it was Marinus van der Lubbe who did that. What is your thought on that,
The
Larry?
Nazis were perfectly capable of setting the fire this way, but I think you're right.
Yeah.
This is just a lucky break, they call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so after that, we are not buying into conspiracy theories today. Good. And so the Nazis, and it's interesting. So the Nazis go after the communists. This is the first political group party that they really crush. And they were their real enemies, if you will. So when you look at the political setup before Hitler is appointed chancellor, it's this polarization politically that happens, where you have the communists on the left and the Nazis on the right, both with ideas about ending the Weimar Republic, right, in different ways. The Nazis want to establish their kind of dictatorship, and the communists want a communist revolution, and they brawl in the streets. The communists have the Red Front fighters, who are just as eager to fight it out as the SA. And so for Hitler, it was important to crush the communist movement. as quickly as possible. And sort of to spin off on that, sort of another interesting sort of way of thinking about this. There's always this question, I think, Hitler comes to power, he's appointed chancellor, why was there not more resistance? And part of the answer why there wasn't more resistance is because the Nazis were very swift in how they grabbed power. But they also eliminated very quickly, or as we just talked about this, the Communist Party, because the communists, they had an organization that on some level rivaled that of the Nazis. They had these paramilitary fighters. And so if there had been a organized resistance with any chance of success, it probably would have come from the communists. And so it was imperative for Hitler to get them out of the way as quickly as possible. And the Life Starfire is a great opportunity to do that. Yeah.
Let's switch for a second. Tell us about, you got a question?
Let's
Go ahead. Mary.
Yeah, I do have another question. In the period of World War I and leading up to it, there was the notion of the new woman, nascent feminism. My question is, when Nazism was in full swing, and women were newly regarded as supporters and incubators of the new warrior class, what kind of resistance did women express, ordinary women, laundresses, waitresses, and
Yeah, I get your question. So you're absolutely right. So
and
this
was the birth control, for example?
okay. So,
Abortion, was it legal? Was it? No.
depends on who. If you were Jewish, sure, you get a Jewish woman, you get an abortion. It's all based on race, right? And so, okay, let's rewind here. So new woman, it's this modern independent woman in the 1920s, single, she has a job, maybe she works at a department store, maybe she's a secretary, spends her money on nice clothing, is independent, has sex before marriage, if she even thinks about marriage, that kind of stuff. So the moment the Nazis come in, this kind of new woman, of course, disappears, right? Because for the Nazis, women belong to this private sphere. The Nazi movement is a male movement, right? It's gendered male. Only men are in charge. I mentioned earlier Gertrud Scholz-Klink, who ran the women's organization that belonged to the Nazi apparatus, but it's really, she's contained. I mean, she has this illusion of influence because she can rule over her women, but that's really it. But then the Nazis also run into sort of inherent contradictions, because ideally, yes, they want the women to be home, to have racially perfect children, and support their men and their soldiers and whatnot. The reality, however, is that women are needed in the workforce. You cannot, the economy is not going to function without women in the workforce. And so women do work, but they are poorly paid, and they have very limited possibilities for advancement. They are limited, I think there are quotas on how many women could go to the university, for instance, right? And so the Nazis could never figure out how to square the circle here between their sort of unrealistic ideal of the women at home bearing children and the real needs of the economy and society to have women outside of that. And so, and that contradiction is also replicated in the BDM, the girls' Nazi organization, the equivalent to the Hitler Youth for the boys, right? Because girls were, ultimately it was mandatory to join, and girls were on the one hand sort of trained in sort of, feminine arts, but they were also trained to be independent and resourceful. And so the Nazis could never figure out how they wanted to train young women as good mothers or simply by the way the BDM was run as something that made young women more independent. Birth control, so I think it's a matter of race. So birth control, abortions, forced sterilization, right? That's part of that spectrum too, for women who didn't fit the Nazi racial profile, right? So there's one book by Wippermann, it's called The Racial State. I mean, we have really not addressed this directly, but everything in Nazi society is about race, whether you have access to something or not, right? So, for instance, the Strength Through Joy program that I talked about, you have to be racially right, otherwise you cannot apply for a program like that, right? So, because the German Volk, Ein Reich and Volk and Führer, it's racially defined. You don't have the racial characteristics, you get nothing, right? And so, birth control, but then the Nazis, there are some interesting elements to that because, for instance, the Nazis were not necessarily against divorce, for instance, because they believed if you have an unhappy marriage, they're not going to have any children. So it's better to facilitate divorce so that they can find another partner with whom they can have children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's just a few vignettes of how complicated this, gendered world was under the Nazis.
A question from the online? Okay, Tim is asking, where did it go?
And we have one here in the audience too.
Yeah, go
Could you
ahead, Gary.
continue the discussion with the youth groups? Were they really Nazi groups, Nazi formatted groups, or were they previously in Germany and then the Nazis took over them?
These were Nazi organizations from the get-go. So the best known one is the Hitler Youth, right, for boys. And the Nazis set that up very early. I'm not sure, but maybe 1922 or so. And so it's quite interesting to see. So the Nazi Party ultimately develops this huge apparatus of organizations, right? For teachers, for lawyers, for women, whatnot, and youth groups are among them too. And they were founded very early. So Hitler is thinking about these structures very early on. And then once the Nazis are in power, then the numbers grow. And so the Hitler Youth is established in 1922. It's a Nazi organization. Does it look a lot like the Boy Scouts? Absolutely, right? The Boy Scouts, they come out of England. They come out of an imperial context, right? What's the name of the guy who founded the Boy Scouts? Baden-Powell, right?
That's it.
Yeah. Who?
Good call.
I'm so horrible with names. I thought I can always ask Larry. He knows all these details. But so, if I remember correctly, the Boy Scouts, when they were established in England, it was sort of to train boys for the empire, to send them to India, right, and rule the Raj, that kind of stuff. And so on the one hand, the Hitler Youth is an organization that is established by the Nazis, but it has a lot of these earlier elements. There were also German youth groups that focused on hiking and physical education. Some of the elements are taken from that as well. And so it's, yes, organizationally pure Nazi. It's the precedent for them elsewhere, absolutely too. Yeah.
Questions, Sue?
Yeah, we have a question online. Are there records of German veterans after World War II struggling with PTSD, depression, guilt? And did veterans tend to live in one part of Germany or another? Actually, it's from Emily.
Okay, so I would think that veterans simply went back to where they came from. I'm not aware of any kind of clustering other than what their hometowns were before. PTSD, I'm sort of struggling to come up with something concrete here. Do you know anything,
No,
Larry?
I can't think of anything. I'm correct, are I not? Once there became a West German government,
Mhm.
didn't veterans receive pensions?
Yes.
But it wasn't something like the GI Bill where they got, pretty much free entrance to the universities
No,
and things
no.
like that.
Well, universities were free anyways.
Yeah, that's
So-
true. Good point.
Different system, different world. Well,
You got it.
well, it's also, it's a tricky situation because there was, so PTSD, so who really suffered the most during the war, right? And so it's, what was the suffering that the German army inflicted on Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe? So it's a complicated, world of suffering, if you will, to think about. And in many ways, the Germans like to see themselves, ordinary Germans like to see themselves as victims at the end of the war, right? As victims of the Nazi regime. And for the army, that meant that there was this fiction upheld that the army had fought the good war, right? The standard military, war according to military rules, and that the evil things had all been committed by the SS in Eastern Europe, in the East. And that's simply not the fact, right? And so many soldiers, ordinary soldiers, were involved in many atrocities against civilian populations. And so I don't think there was much room for a general recognition of ordinary soldiers suffering.
I would guess that soldiers suffering PTSD from World War II on the German side, there would have been nobody, certainly the victorious Allies weren't going to offer them any help, and there wasn't really a West German government and for several years after World War II. And these are fairly expensive programs, I would guess, and I'm not so, in World War II, they called it combat fatigue, but that was when you were in combat and you cracked up and they put you back out there. I don't know that there was much talk in anybody's army about the long-lasting effects of being served in the military, carrying back into civilian life.
Yeah, well, and you're right. The two Germanys are not established until May and September of 1949. So there are 4 years where no large programs really could have been established. Marietta?
Yeah, well, I think, of course, it wasn't called PTSD then. And I think it was shell shock.
And that's sort of the World War
My
I
own
term,
father worked with
Combat fatigue.
so-called PTSD, but shell-shocked American soldiers at Fort Eustis, Virginia during the war. He was a psychiatrist. But I think that, probably in Germany, there was little opportunity for this sort of help.
Yeah.
I've never heard of any.
No, I'm not familiar with that. I'm sure that whoever needed immediate medical help, you could go to the hospital, but I'm not aware of any kind of program.
Did the Nazis have a program or any way that they promoted their technological advances, both the military and the weaponry that they developed for the war? They had all kinds of new inventions, rocketry, submarines, and ships, and they were really advanced in some degrees, more than the Western allies were. Did they promote that, or is that just a happenstance?
Of course, that new weaponry was developed all the time. There's the the rocket facilities in Peenemünde, for instance, which is not that far away from Pola, actually. I've mapped that out once because I want to visit
Well, the
Pola.
Baltic, isn't it?
It is on the Baltic, yes. And so there were the V1 and V2 rockets that were developed there. So Hitler, in the later stages of the war, he was, looking for this wonder weapon that could turn the war around for him, right? And so the V rockets, the V stands for the German word Vergeltung, which means revenge. Yeah. So yes, and so I mean, Werner von Braun, right, the rocket engineer, he gets snatched up by the United States.
Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, Paperclip and others, yes.
Somebody
Yeah.
came here.
Yeah.
Well, the V1 was literally a flying bomb. You just shot it. It didn't have a mind of its own or anything like that. The V2 was really more sophisticated. And there was literally no defense against it. The Germans also invented the jet aircraft engine first. And for submarines, a snorkel, which is a breathing device, which enables them to stay submerged. But in the long run, they came too late and they were not properly used. And in some cases, Hitler's intervention slowed the process down.
Well, and also in the end, the resources were no longer there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, slave labor is used.
Which is not efficient.
Which is not efficient and incredibly cruel and lethal, right? And so the raw materials were often missing. And so the foundation for that kind of mass production was, virtually impossible in the end, yeah. Do we have anything on
Yeah,
that?
Katie would like to know the titles of the books again that on the desk that you
Please,
were,
here?
yes.
Oh, I'm not sharing. Just.
And
Must
I,
pay. Don't let it go.
Okay, so
I'm going to put you onto the camera.
okay,
And also we put a link in the comments to the resources that Ute has recommended for
Yeah.
further discovery.
okay. So
You could
I point this at
Find
the
it on our
Okay,
website.
so I bought two, the bottom one is just my, my basic textbook that I use for my students. I don't know why I brought that. So I bought two books, that are quite recent to give you an idea of some recent scholarship that I find quite interesting. And so this one here is by Despina Stratigakos, and it's called Hitler at Home. So here I can show that here.
Perfect.
Despina, there you go, right? And so she's an architectural historian. And so in this book, she looks at how Hitler's private persona was carefully crafted for propaganda purposes. How, for instance, Hitler chose his interiors deliberately, very high quality things for his different offices and private facilities, for instance, in the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, to convey sort of this his private life as something that was exemplary and representing the best of German style. The way that his photo shoots in this private environment were used to further sort of promote his, public persona, often sort of softening the edges a little bit to make him look like this gentle man in this refined environment. One of the most interesting chapters in this book is about a woman that I had not heard of until I read this book, and this is a woman named Gerdi Trost, who did a lot of interior design for him and was basically very close to him for a long time. And so we always know about Leni Riefenstahl, and so here's an interior designer architect who had this same kind of personal connection to Hitler for a long time. And so sort of another element of these people who were in Hitler's close orbit, because direct access to Hitler always meant a certain amount of power and influence. To be close to Hitler, to socialize with him, implied a great deal of power. And so the other books, so let me put this here
There we go.
There we go. This is by Robert, Larry, is that Gelately? I always
Yeah,
read
I think that's right.
Gelately, and it's called Hitler's True Believers, How Ordinary People Became Nazis. And so this is exactly what I've been, thinking about for this presentation here. How did ordinary people find their way to accepting, to embracing the Nazis? And so it goes against this narrative that Germans were duped and they were forced to endure the Nazi regime. And so he argues, and this is a book that just came out this year, so this is almost hot off the press. This is 2020. And so it focuses on the fact that the Nazis offered things that people actually did like, and that people willingly and for rational reasons, rational to them, supported the Nazis. And so this is really, I mentioned Alltagsgeschichte, the history of everyday life. That's sort of an example of that.
Thank you. Any other questions here?
If you were gonna watch something.
Yeah.
Movie, video, series, that would tell you the most about life in the Third Reich, what would it be?
Life in the Third Reich, that's actually tough, because so everyday life doesn't make for good movies, right?
Correct.
Ordinary life is not exciting enough for that. So the most movies that I can think of about the Nazi period are more sort of extraordinary stories, because that's what we are interested in.
What would you do? What would you watch?
Extraordinary. There's an older movie, I think it's called Europa.
Mhm.
And it's one of these stories where you wouldn't believe it if somebody came up with this plot. It's this Jewish young man who hides his Jewish identity quite successfully, and becomes a Hitler Youth boy and just tries to hide his identity. And the biggest problem that he has is a physical issue, right? As a Jewish boy, what distinguishes you from non-Jewish boys? Exactly. And every once in a while, if you get sort of checked out for fitness, that comes up. And so he manipulated his own body and tried to hide his circumcision. So, and it's a true story. And so it's also an interesting gender thing, right? Women could hide if they, didn't look the way Nazis thought Jews looked like. They could hide. There were no clear physical characteristics that would give it away. For Jewish boys, it's a different thing. So physical examination could sort of determine that. And so Europa is a absolutely compelling story of a young man who manages to survive by pretending to be a Nazi boy.
If I had to pick, you're right, movies about Nazi Germany almost always focus on some extraordinary event.
Right.
I would pick Downfall, which is about the last 10 days in Hitler's bunker. Comes in two versions. One is English and one is German with subtitles. I much prefer the German with English subtitles. The thing about this movie is the man who plays Hitler is Bruno Ganz. One of the, I guess he's now deceased, isn't he?
Yeah.
One of the most famous of all German actors, and he literally takes over Hitler's personality, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's a compelling.
In fact, he was criticized, was he not, for making Hitler seem too human?
Well, that's all. So the English version that you talk about, that's simply a separate movie, right?
Yeah, it's dubbed.
Oh, you mean the
Yeah.
German movie just dubbed?
Yeah, and I find it strange hearing Hitler talk English, or Goebbels talk English.
I mean, that's sort of my personal issue. I prefer German language productions because they just seem, more credible to me. Because they speak German. And so when I see movies about the Nazi period where everybody speaks proper British English, The suspension of disbelief, it's really difficult. I can't, but that's just from my own German background. And so that's sort of one thing that does matter. And so I would always recommend the German version. And Downfall, I think it's a really good movie. It chronicles the last days in the bunker. So it's not necessarily from an ordinary perspective in that respect, but it does have a lot of scenes that play outside. When Berlin is bombed and ordinary people are trying to save themselves. So there's a little bit of that in there as well. So, but in terms of ordinary life in that respect, so a fairly recent movie, and I don't think I put it on my list because I did put it. Did I put it? No, I have the book on my list and not the movie. So, a book/movie, A Woman in Berlin.
Oh, I've read that.
Yeah. So this was initially so it's a book that was turned into a movie, and so it's a book that was written anonymously. By now we know who the woman is. She was a journalist who lived in Berlin at the end of the war, and so she experiences the first wave of the Soviet soldiers arriving in Berlin and the mass rapes that ensued. And so, and then that was turned into a movie several years ago, but there's some issues with it. Yeah.
Can you get most of these movies on cable, or do you know?
Well, I've seen Downfall on cable,
Have you?
yes.
I have the DVD, so, but I think I have, hard to tell. I mean,
Just have to search for it.
it's a crapshoot. I mean, you have to, I often, when I'm trying to find something, I go through the usual suspects, right? I try Amazon Prime, I
Right.
try Netflix.
No worries.
Sometimes you can buy it on YouTube video, and sometimes it's on Hulu. I don't have a subscription, I'm out of luck. And I have to say, I haven't bought the DVD in a long time, because mostly I can find something somewhere, yeah.
Any other
Let's
questions?
see, over here.
Did the Nazis do much to promote the traditional German history, like from the very end of the country, before their time? Or did they try to stamp that down, or they just, they know they were the Aryan race and all that, and they didn't know if that interfaced with the traditional history or not?
I think the sort of the glorified version of the German past fit quite nicely with their objectives, right? And so they were the Third Reich, so it makes a lot of sense to promote the First and the Second Reich to the to children. And I'm sure that there was a very distorted depiction of World War I and the way it ended, right, in textbook, that it was treachery at home by the socialists, by the communists, and the Jews that brought that around. And so they reinterpreted the past to fit their own ends, and also to show Hitler as somebody who is resurrecting this old glorious past, right? And so they often deliberately reached back into history to reinterpret history in Nazi ways, right? One of the most notorious, and goes beyond school, but it also relates to history. So one of the most notorious anti-Semitic movies that the Nazis ever made is a movie, it's called Jud Süß. It was done in 1940, and it is a distorted interpretation of a real historical case from the 17th or 18th century, I think 17th century, of a so-called court Jew at the Württemberg court, I believe, who really was executed for made-up reasons at the time, and then the Nazis turned it into a historical movie to show how German Jews in the past have been treacherous and greedy and all that. And so they take a real episode from the past, twist it, and use it for their purposes. And we've been talking about Kohlberg, right? The movie that plays, that was created in 45, and it goes back, is it the Napoleonic Wars?
Napoleon, yeah.
Wars of Liberation. And so, that was sort of something that seemed to work in terms of propaganda too, to reach back to the early 19th century and look at the valiant efforts of Germans to fight the French, right? To create that, turn that into a propaganda movie that could be used to motivate people towards the end of the war. So history, so that the Nazis were good and clever at using history and molding it in a way that they could show themselves as the natural sort of successors of this glorious German past. That's how they wanted to portray that.
How about how about one online here for a minute?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Probably getting close to our last question. What was the beer hall
Putsch.
Beer hall push. Okay, so that's November 9th of 1923.
23.
Thank you.
Welcome.
We went all through those. So at the end of 23, and so beer hall push in Bavaria. And so at the time, the Nazi party is small, and Hitler completely misreads the political situation in Bavaria. So I think it's a good example to show that Hitler, not everything that he tried to do worked out. He was not, he turned it into something other than a failure ultimately, but this was a miscalculation. And so there was a very conservative government in place in Bavaria at the time, and they were holding a meeting in a beer hall. And Hitler thought that they would make common cause with him. If he stormed that meeting, they would sort of align themselves with him, and he could take over the Bavarian government, and from that vantage point on, he could take over the German government. And the conservatives in Bavaria, they are not interested in making common cause with Hitler. There are some there's a certain number of Nazis who come who march onto Munich and try to take over the city, but they are defeated by police and military forces. A couple of Nazis are killed, who later are then used as martyrs, the early martyrs to the cause. But at the moment, it was an abject failure of Hitler and the Nazis to gain some momentum. But that is also the event that he is put on trial, and he's sentenced to a very mild prison sentence because many judges were a little bit blind on their right eye during that time period. And so that's the time when he writes Mein Kampf, right? So his political testament. And then once he is released from prison, he reorganizes the party. But it's sort of, it was a failure at the time, a strategic failure. After that, Hitler decides that he needs to gain power through the political system and not against it. And sometimes we forget that there was a fascist dictator before him, right? Mussolini. And Mussolini had gained power in 1922 with his march on Rome, right? So, and in a way, this almost looks like an attempt by Hitler sort of to emulate that approach, and it didn't work for him.
I think are we out of time?
We're about, yep, we're right on time, and I'm going to Thank you both, and Larry, what do we have up next?
You want me to talk about that?
Yes.
In 2 weeks, Professor Keith Balkman is the chair of the Political Science Department, and I are going to answer questions and discuss the 2020 presidential elections. Pray for us. I would presume there'll be some kind of resolution by that time, or at least we'll have some idea. But it's a topic we're both interested in. We've both been looking and thinking about things. We're going to try to deal with some historical precedents to this. But we expect to do not much talking and a lot of answering of questions. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, and thank you all for coming to our report. Thank you. We'll see you next time.
Hope we go, thanks, good night.